All right, well, good afternoon, and thank you for staying for our mystery panel, which is the final panel for today. So Will Zeilinger writes mystery novels that range from 1950s hard-boiled to contemporary. His short stories have appeared in the anthologies Haunted Tales, Stories from Beyond the Grave, and Murder USA. Will has a bachelor's degree in graphic design and worked as an art director, graphic designer, illustrator, and photographer for more than 35 years. Before launching a writing career, the only writing he did was advertising copy. He lives in Southern California, where he co-writes the Skylar Drake Mystery Series with his wife, Janet Lynn, and is a member of Sisters in Crime LA and California Writers Club Long Beach. Will took novel writing classes and joined writers groups, but what has helped him the most are his friends who are the published authors who mentor, encourage, critique, and listen to him while he continues to learn his craft. Finding time to write while life happens is a challenge, but he finds a way to work hard at writing at least 1 or 2 hours a day. So help me welcome Will Zeilinger.
Thank you, Julie. Well, we have an interesting panel today. We have Nancy Boyarsky, we have Connie DiMarco, Lida Sederis, and Jeri Westerson. Now, the thing that they all have in common, even though they write different periods of time and about different characters, is that we all write things that are mysterious, and sometimes things that are criminal, and things that are quite dark and depressing. The subject we're trying to discuss today, when we'll start at this end, is how, because we tried to call this panel Seriously Funny, because death and dying and murder and crime is not that funny, but if you watch TV shows or you read some of our writers' novels, you'll see that there's always a little something in there that makes you giggle. So, Nancy writes about her detective, Nicole Graves. Mm-hmm. And tell us a little bit about Nicole and yourself.
Okay, well, I'll just get my biography out of the way. I was a freelance writer for many years for magazines and newspapers, and I was a magazine editor for a bit, and then I ended up for a long stretch as a communications director for ARCO when it existed. I don't know if you know, but ARCO is no more. It's owned by British Petroleum. So that's me. And I wrote my first book in the 90s and could not sell it. I self-published it about 6 years ago, and a publisher saw it and contacted me and asked if they could reissue it under their imprint. And I've been with them ever since. And it's a small publishing house in North Carolina, and they're wonderful. Just so much better than the big publishers, because they really go all out for you. My heroine, Nicole Graves, starts out the series in the first book. She's a business manager, or rather the office manager for a law firm in Los Angeles, for a very large, what they call white shoe law firm. And the part of the job she really likes is when she gets to assist the in-house investigator. Through the course of the series, she herself becomes a licensed private investigator. And she has most of the cases that come into the company she works for are corporate or legal cases, working with law firms and corporations, looking for shell companies and things like that. But somehow her cases always go wrong, and something violent happens. And she's this petite, very pretty woman in her early 30s with dimples. and is soft-spoken, and everybody thinks she's this sweet little thing, which she kind of resents because she doesn't think she's a sweet little thing. And in fact, she's carrying a gun and mace in her purse after a few really bad brushes with violence. So she's a pretty normal person. She isn't damaged, but she is a bit of a daredevil and sometimes acts before she thinks. Okay, I'll move on to you.
Connie, tell us a little bit, Julia Bonatti.
Yeah, I published 2 series. One is a cozy series set in Vermont. It's called The Soup Lovers Mysteries, and there are 5 books in that series, but my most recent series is The Zodiac Mysteries. My protagonist is an astrologer in San Francisco whose clients come to her with their problems, with their dilemmas, and invariably she ends up becoming involved in crime. The Zodiac Mysteries are somewhat darker, but I've had a lot of fun writing them. I am not a funny writer. I don't think I'm funny at all, but I have had people say, "Oh my God, I laughed so hard at that spot," you know. I don't think it's possible to try to write funny. I think humor in mysteries or very, very dark thrillers comes from characters and situational elements. And Julia has a private clientele, but she spends a lot of time at an occult bookshop called the Mystic Eye that's run by her good friend. And there are a huge lot of really extreme characters that also work at the Mystic Eye. Tarot readers, psychics, past life readers, all sorts of people. So a lot of the humor comes from that. In fact, one of my really favorite authors that I've fallen in love with is a Danish author named Jussi Adler-Olsen, and he writes the darkest stuff you could ever imagine, but his sidekick is hysterically funny, and I find myself in the middle of the night laughing out loud and thinking, how can I laugh at this? This crime is so dark, it's so disgusting, but yet he makes me laugh. So I think the juxtaposition of humor and darkness comes from the situation, comes from the characters.
Thank you. Lida, tell us about Carrie Locke.
I write the Southern California Mystery Series, and my heroine the action takes place all around, in and around Southern California. It's loosely based on my former life as an entertainment attorney working for a movie studio, only I didn't contend with any homicides. Number 3 in the series, Murder, Double or Nothing, was just released a couple of months ago. And my heroine, Carrie Locke, is a newly minted lawyer who lands a dream job in a movie studio. And in the first book, she's promptly blackmailed into investigating a suspicious death. You might wonder, why would a new attorney be blackmailed into looking into a death? Because she happens to be the daughter of a late, great PI, and together they cracked a few high-profile cases, which makes everyone believe she's inherited her dad's sleuthing skills. But has she? That question is asked in every book. She also inherited her dad's collection of weaponry, legal and illegal, and her gene for caution is a recessive one, which gets her into trouble all the time. I put a lot of my real life in my book, and my books are actually very lighthearted. I can't write dark because my day job is running a legal nonprofit up in the Santa Barbara area, and it can be quite grueling. So I need to write light. I need to have humor in my books, and I look for ways to insert it in there all the time, because I need to smile and laugh and have a good time, so hopefully my readers will have fun as well. I think that's it.
Thank you, Lee. Now, we're going to turn the clock back like tonight when you go to sleep, but we're going to turn it way back for Jeri Westerson, who's writing about, is his name Leopold in your new series?
Leopold, yes. Does that mean I get to be younger? Turn back time? I write several series. The 2 mysteries that I'm currently writing are the Crispin Guest Medieval Noir series. That's medieval mysteries. And it's medieval noir, so that means it's pretty dark. But this new series is not a traditional mystery. It's a steampunk series, historical fantasy. But Leopold Casimir is the great enchanter. He's a magician in Victorian London. And he can really perform real magic through his talent of summoning demons. So, just as you do. So he has worked with Scotland Yard previously on some very strange murders. So he's called in again to work on this one that looks like the job of Jack the Ripper. And we soon discovered that that is not so, that there's all sorts of strange things going on in this neo-Victorian London where dirigibles are flying through the air all the time, and Prince Albert survived his brush with death. So there's a little alternate history going on. But there's demons and magic and a magical automaton that's one of Leopold's friends and helpmates. So there's all kinds of fun things going on in there. There's some dark things as well, but there's always humor that comes out in my books because I like to crack jokes and crack wise, and so there's naturally that going on. But it really does help cut some of the tensions sometimes. Some things are going on very, very dark and dramatic. And, when the sidekick in the medieval mysteries, he was an orphan cutpurse that Crispin, the former knight, who is now the tracker of London, which is a private detective, took in. And now he's lived with him for all these years. He's grown up. Now he's 23 or something years old now with a family and children. And they have worked together and his presence, Jack Tucker's presence in Crispin's life, has tempered his lifestyle, has made him a little less grumpy as the years go on. So, and the humor comes out of the situations and Jack Tucker's just general sunniness about life, even in noir London.
Thank you very much. Now, the question I'm going to ask everybody is, why did you get into writing about crime and mystery? But there are all flavors of mystery and crime. There's starting with what's called cozy mysteries, if you remember, like Murder, She Wrote, and a lot of the books that are crossover between romance and mystery. Then they progressively get a little darker till you get all the way to very down the rabbit hole noir kind of books. What made you start writing this? Let's start at that end, come this way.
Well, my medieval noirs they're not as noir could be, because I realized that my market is people who like medieval mystery, so I wasn't going to go that noir. They're getting less noir as it goes on, so as I get happier with my character and he gets happier. But it's fun. It's fun to take it down those dark alleys and everywhere you turn, there's a murder and there's a knife flashing in the dark, and so you want to kind of take it to some of those places, and making your character so miserable that something's got to bring him up, and a good murder is the thing for it. It's just, I think it's just. To me, there was a sensibility of the Middle Ages, London. They didn't build outward because they couldn't. It wasn't their property, so they built upward. And so there are these twisting little streets that are dark. And you have to really look for the sky sometimes. So I just liked that whole milieu and used it in this setting. So he's a hard-boiled detective, really, in the Middle Ages.
The books that I like to read were starting with Nancy Drew, and I like the Stephanie Plum series by Janet Ivanovich, and I love the Alexander McCall Smith Botswana series, #1 Ladies Detective Agency. So I always used to ask myself after reading those books, how do they do that? Can I ever possibly write a mystery? It seems so complex. But then I happened to win a scholarship to the San Francisco Writers Conference that kind of gave me the confidence to do something more. And I came home and started writing my first mystery, and I had no idea what to write about, so I based it loosely on my own life. And I just love pushing the boundaries between right and wrong. All the things that I can't do or I didn't do when I was working in the movie studio, my heroine does. That's why she has the illegal weaponry that she uses, and fortunately, she doesn't get caught, so that makes it even more fun. She loves breaking and entering, something that I have not done. I practiced it, but I don't dare do it for obvious reasons. So again, she's very good with a gun. She's never actually used one. She's conked people in the head with it, but she's never actually shot one, although she's a very good shot. So all the things that I would never do in real life, she does, and I live vicariously through her. She has sidekicks. Her best friend, or one of her best friends, is a woman who kind of resembles Queen Latifah and has a very positive attitude and a lot of common sense that my heroine lacks, so she joins her in cracking the crimes. And she's got 2 male love interests. I mean, how fun is that? She goes back and forth. You can't decide which one is going to be the one. In the meantime, they all help her crack her cases. So I'm just writing these because I had fun reading them, and I now have fun writing them.
And isn't it fun murdering people that we know?
Well, I'd never admit to that.
Only in the books.
I am like the others. I started out with Nancy Drew and Trixie Belden as a young kid, and I've always loved mysteries and thrillers. When I was in college, I used to read a lot of sci-fi because it was such a total escape, but I always went back to mysteries and thrillers. But to be really honest, I never in a million years thought I would ever be a writer. I never had any desire to write. I spent most of my life working as an actress, a mostly unemployed actress, but occasionally working. And I always had a day job. But one day I was working on a set, and I realized that I had 2 scenes and 3 lines, and I was completely bored out of my skull. And I thought, I'm going to write a mystery book. I'm going to try to write a mystery book. So I went home, and that's when I came up with the idea of setting a mystery in San Francisco, which I think is a great city to use as a backdrop because of the fog, because of the narrow alleyways, because of the cluster of houses and buildings and people. And I wanted my protagonist to have an unusual occupation, so I made her an astrologer. I wrote the first book, and I was completely blown away when a New York agent was interested. And I signed a contract, and my agent couldn't sell it for many years. And in the meantime, this other opportunity with the Soup Lovers series came about, and I grew up in New England, so it was really easy to write about New England. And what was the question? Will? I forgot the question.
Why did you start writing this?
Why did I start writing? Okay, the thing for me with mysteries and thrillers, maybe not thrillers so much, but the thing to me is the exploration of human psychology. Why do people do what they do, and why do they commit this unforgivable act that cannot be taken back? What are the forces that drive people? Personally, I've probably wanted to murder a few people in my life. I haven't done it. I hope I never do. It's terrible karma. But I always find it very interesting when a relatively quiet, mild-mannered person actually does it, whether in a fit of passion or plans it and does it deliberately as premeditated murder because they believe their survival is at stake. And I think it's that exploration that's always fascinated me. So.
And Nancy, how'd you get mixed up in all this?
Well, I've always loved mysteries. I like books in which something dramatic happens, and what could be more dramatic than a killing, a murder. But I never knew how to go about writing, putting together a book. That really stopped me until I took a course at UCLA. They have a writer's program, UCLA Extension, in mystery writing. And the first night of the first class, the teacher handed out a 1-page sheet of instructions, how to set up a mystery plot. And I had it. That was it. I mean, I took more classes, but that was the only really valuable thing I got out of those courses. And I get a lot of, I love setting up the process. You've got your killer, you've got your detective character, you've got your witnesses, you've got your suspects, and in the course of writing it, I don't outline, I don't plan ahead, I just know these facts. There was a murder at this time by this person, and this other person is going to solve it. And I just go through, and it's like doing a puzzle, putting all these pieces together and having it come out at the end. I do a lot of rewriting. And it is fascinating to see why people do things and how they do them and what their attitude toward what they've done is, including the detective, who has a lot of feelings about defending herself. In my case, Nicole's killed a few people, actually, in the course of defending herself. And the bad guys have their own reasons that they think is justified. It's mainly about money. But I just find the whole process fun, especially the rewriting. The hard part is getting the initial plot put together and have it make sense and be, consistent throughout. And then after that, rewriting is fun, really fun.
That's what many of us have been told, is that in fiction, when you're writing fiction, it has to make sense. In real life, it never makes sense. In fact,
True.
We were just reading a story the other day, a news story the other day, about this older man who lives in a senior home, and he went and shot his friend, and then tried to escape in his wheelchair. If one of us wrote that, they'd say, "Oh, that's so contrived," but that kind of things happen. And then there was another news story just recently about the guy who's robbing a 7-Eleven, and he looks out the window across the street, and somebody's stealing his truck.
That's a good one.
If you'll notice on the signs here, all of our authors belong to a group in Los Angeles called Sisters in Crime. I'm just allowed to come along, so they let some of us come along with this. But my wife and I write a hard-boiled detective set in the 1950s in Hollywood. And the reason we got into that is that neither one of us grew up here. And doing the research is the fun part. All the stuff that we're learning about Hollywood in the 50s and Southern California, that we have to rely on a lot of people who did, because we weren't here. But sometimes, like the stories I told you, sometimes it's just funny. I mean, death isn't funny, crime scenes aren't funny, and we try to be appropriate if there's going to be like a snappy, funny dialogue, that it's not at the wrong place. So we look at inserting any humor, if it's done intentionally, is like climbing flights of stairs. You need to stop every so often and rest before you start the next one. And when you're writing something dark, you have to stop and rest once in a while. Do you think gallows humor has a place? Any of us here? People, guillotine.
Well, I think it does. I think that I don't think there's much of it in my books, though, actually.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like anyone intentionally puts humor in their books.
No.
I do.
Yeah. I do too, actually.
Okay, well, that's good. That's what we're trying to find out
And
here.
I have my dark situations, like the homicides, the beating up of people, happen off page, because I don't want to see it. In the opening of my newest book, my heroine, you don't know it, but she's actually watching a movie being filmed, and it's a car chase, and there's some bad guy shooting at the victim, the intended victim. And my heroine, again, it's not revealed till after, I think, on page 2 or 3, but she's watching, and the reason why she's watching is because she's so frustrated, because they keep shooting these bullets like a squirt gun. They'll keep missing. So she starts mumbling and making comments, and the director says, do you mind? We're trying to shoot a movie here. And then a homicide does occur, but off page, because while they're arguing, the victim is actually really, well, we think he could be really killed. I don't know if that's the case, but so anything that happens that's gallows, if you would, black comedy, if you will, it's off the page. You're not going to see it, because I don't want to see it. I don't want any blood and gore in my books or anything that's too grim, again, because my intention is to write light and humorous.
But grim is okay, sometimes. Well, the Crispin book that I'm writing now, the penultimate in the series, they find a skeleton in a wall. So it gets kind of humorous because when they come and get Crispin, the private eye, he's a little reluctant, but his apprentice, he wants to see the skeleton. And so, let's go see the skeleton. So everybody goes to see the skeleton, and he's kind of grinning when he's looking at this. And the apprentice Jack is always a little cautious when there's actual corpses, bodies, but the skeleton is kind of cool. I mean, Middle Ages, they're a little more down to earth, and they're used to public hangings and whatnots, and so skeleton is kind of cool. So, funny. I like to see skeleton.
Nancy, do you intentionally put any humor in yours?
Oh, I do, and yeah, I do. For example, in the last book, The Ransom, the heroine she's working on a case that involves a kidnapped victim whose father-in-law thinks she engineered her own kidnapping, which resulted in his son's death. And so in the course of working on the case, Nicole's sister is kidnapped under much the same circumstances. So now here she is, she's still working on the case and having to pretend things are normal because she's been directed by the kidnappers not to call the police, not to do anything to, publicize this. And she has to deliver the ransom, and they have this really complex way of directing her down to Union Station and checking a bag with the ransom in it, and then putting the checks, the
Key? Key?
No, her receipt for the check for her bag in a planter in one of the garden rooms at the station. And so she goes there and she discovers a note to her saying, "Reclaim the bag. Actually, this was just a test. Your real ransom drop is way up above Sunset Boulevard in Laurel Canyon." And she's left her phone at home. She doesn't have a car. There's no public transportation. She can't call an Uber because actually there are no telephones at Union Station. Did you know? No public phones. So she actually just gets into an Uber that's unloading, and the driver orders her out, and she bribes him to drive her to this place, and then she asks him, "What will it take for you to lend me this car for the night?" And he looks at her and says, "Are you crazy? My brand new car, I owe a fortune on it." And she pulls out of the ransom money a band of bills marked $2,000, and he's like, afraid he'll lose his car, but he can't resist the money. Finally, they negotiate, and he takes the money and gets out of the car. And he says, "Well, wait a minute." He's way up in the boonies up in Laurel Canyon. How am I going to get home? And she says, "Call an Uber, Daniel. You can afford it." So stuff like that. She's in this terrible situation, but I managed to insert that. And sometimes my villains, like in The Swap, my villains are like the gang who couldn't shoot straight. They're completely incompetent, and yet they managed to follow her, terrorize her, and kidnap her ultimately before she escapes. So yeah, there are different ways you can do that.
Yeah, what we've done is we usually insert, because they're there, a quirky character of some kind.
Yeah.
Some people might call it comedy relief, but there's always somebody who wanders into your story that is just off the wall, just totally wacko, and sometimes they're quite funny.
I think it's the thing about writing mysteries and thrillers is you have to maintain the tension, the suspense as the story moves along, and you have to maintain interest no matter what kind of genre you're writing in. And the thing that whether it's humor or some other device to give the reader a break, a breath, because you can't read 10 pages of a bank robbery and not want to take a deep breath before you can move on to the next thing. You know, in the Soup Lovers mysteries, they take place at a soup shop in the little town of Snowflake, Vermont. And there's a group of local characters that hang out at the soup shop that everybody knows. It's a very tiny town. They all know each other. So no matter how dark the crimes were, and I do like to describe the bodies and the blood spatter, everybody feels safe once the action moves back to the soup shop. So it was juxtaposing those two elements, I think, that gave the readers a break in what a writer friend of mine called dark cozies. That's what she called the Soup Lovers mysteries. But yeah, you need that break. You need that relief from the tension. But on the other hand, you have the same problem of how do you keep the reader turning pages? Because when you're writing mysteries or thrillers, you want the reader turning pages and not stopping and awake till the wee hours. And there's nothing nicer than getting a Facebook message that says, I didn't get any sleep last night. I couldn't put your book down. I mean, that's wonderful to hear for a writer.
That is great. And also, at the end, I know Connie and some others, if you want to find out more, you can leave your email with them. And
Yeah, we have a sign-in thing. Most of us have newsletters.
You do. You do. So, I mean, I think we've got some time now for some questions, if you'd like some questions and answers. No?
They're all
That's
afraid of us.
mysterious right there.
Well, sometimes the humor is accidental, too. In one of my Crispin books, The Silence of Stones, in the story, some Scottish patriots, I guess you can call them, even in that time period they wouldn't have been called that, stole the Stone of Scone from under the coronation chair from Westminster Abbey. And I meant to write this sort of Macbethian sort of tale with these Scots in London. And they came out more like the Keystone Cops. So, I mean, I just went with it. I said, okay, there's some serious stuff that happens, but when these guys show up, it's definitely comedy. And I like to actually, shake it up a little in the series. Sometimes it's very dark and bad things happen to Crispin, and sometimes you kind of lighten it up. But I hadn't meant to in this book. It just turned out that way. It's like, well, I guess this is going to be a funny book.
Well,
So.
the things we learn, before I started writing, I worked, before I went back to college, in fact, I was working in a warehouse, and one of the fellows I worked with used to be a Kansas City detective, and he said, do you know why criminals always get caught? And I said, no. He goes, because they're stupid. Because if they weren't stupid, they wouldn't be criminals. And so as a result, some of the villains that we write anyway are kind of hilarious in a way, only because that they think that they're all that in a bag of chips when they're not.
Because there are no super villains. I mean, not really. No. Only in politics. But I mean, you're not going to have anybody sitting in their lair under a volcano and like in James Bond. You're not going to have that situation where they're really these super villains. So I always object to those kinds of stories, but in a book, in fiction, you want your villains to be interesting and really have it in for the hero, perhaps.
They do. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just wondering, out of all of you, is it really important to follow the series? In other words, you start with the first one in your series and keep reading, because I wondered whether if I had skipped one, would it make a difference in the one after? Would there be something I would have lost and not known or understood when I come to the one that's like 2 or 3 past the one I skipped?
Did everyone hear the question?
Oh.
Oh, she wondered if these books are,
Right.
if you have to read from the beginning and
Yes.
just in order. Mine are each standalones. You don't have to read the one before at all.
Yeah, Sue Grafton talked about this
Yeah.
because she had such a long-lived series, and she said it was a fine balance she found, and I think that I've done this as well. That each book must be able to be read as a standalone, and you might refer back to an earlier crime. And give the reader just enough, but you don't want to bore them if they haven't read that book, so you don't want to go overboard. And she talked a lot about that. She said that she spent a lot of time trying to balance those two elements so that each could be read as a standalone, and yet there might be a reference to an earlier book, and you didn't want to leave a big, huge question mark in the reader's mind about that. Just enough that the reader would know, like, oh, okay, she had a run-in with that homicide detective on her last case. So, it's finding that balance.
I have a question. Can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. I heard Sue Grafton speak at the Santa Barbara Writers Conference when she was writing K or around in there. You could see she was really royally tired of that series. And she committed to the whole alphabet. I think she got a second wind somewhere around Q or whatever. But what about you? My publisher won't let me get allow me to have my character fall in love and get married, because then that would be the end of the series. Now, this can't.
Cozy series, there can't be any sex in a cozy series.
Oh well, my book is not a cozy at all.
I think there's a difference
Never mind.
between it being
Okay.
a serial and being a series. Most of them I think we write are episodic, where we might have the same characters, but they have a new adventure each time.
Oh, yeah, and meet other characters, and she has different romances in some of the books. But what about the other panelists?
So you're asking how do we keep it fresh?
I'm asking you, do you anticipate a point where you're going to get sick of this character?
Every time I'm currently doing number 4 right now, and every time I reach a stumbling block, I ask myself, why am I writing this series? But you keep it fresh by, as Will mentioned, you add quirky characters. If I find that a scene isn't working, I completely change it around. For example, in the book book 4 is what I'm currently writing. She has to go into a church and find a witness who saw something happen, but she doesn't know who the witness is because she can't get a hold of the police report. So I had her go in there. I write straight when I do my first draft. There's no humor. I just want to get the story out because I write by the seat of my pants, so I have no clue what I'm doing. There might be little humor, but that comes in much later. But anyway, so she's in a church, and the first time I wrote it, she was just interviewing some woman who was a volunteer there. Totally dull. So when I went back to do it, I turned that woman witness into a feisty octogenarian who was very opinionated, and my heroine learned that she neglected to tell the police one vital piece of information, and she got that out of her by winning her over. So I think quirky characters and new characters, I have, of course, new villains every time, right?
Sure.
And then I sprinkle backstory throughout, so it's a standalone. So as you read the entire book, you'll learn about her relationship with her mother, it's like a helicopter mother, what happened to her father, the late great PI, and the 2 men in her life. So I think I answered both questions, yeah.
Well, each of my books are sort of standalones, but the backstory has threads all the way to the first book. So you can read them as standalones, but you will want to go to the beginning because the backstory of the character has a particular timeline. And with each book, it's a year later in their lives. So we are aiming towards a particular year, and I'm on book, the 12th was released, the 13th is coming out next April, and I'm writing the 14th. So, and I know how it's all going to end in the 15th. So there is something going on, but I try to kind of catch you up a little without boring the people who know what's going on. So I've seen it over and over in reviews that I know this is a series, but I've only read this one, and I was caught up easily. So it's like that. But I like to, because they're mysteries, and I always think that my mystery isn't all that great, so I'm going to give you something else to read while you're reading this mystery about this character, and the stuff going on in his life. So that's where that
Yeah,
ends up.
it's always a, go
I
ahead.
was just going to kind of come in on what you said, because I tend to read yours all in a row.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, okay, when I get to number 3, there's something I read that I go, oh, that's why that happened in number 2. You know, so
Yeah.
that there are things that are later that I kind of go, oh.
And as we get later in the series, it does refer back to older things. So.
Kind of go, sometimes I read too fast, and, you know, it's like, oh, and then, oh, that happened. And then I get to the next book, and something is referred to, and I go, aha, now I understand.
See, that's the special thing for readers who read the whole series.
And,
You know,
and it's our
kind of-
job to entertain you.
It's,
I mean, we like to write things that we like too, but our job is to entertain you and keep you.
right. I think it's such a personal matter for an author as to when they've had enough of a series or a protagonist. Henning Mankell only wrote 10 Wallander books. Anne Cleves, who writes the Vera series and the Shetland series, she couldn't possibly churn out enough books to cover the TV series. So, of course, many of those stories are written by other
And think about
Screenwriters.
Midsummer Mysteries.
Oh
she only
my
wrote
God.
5 or something?
Yeah,
And then
yeah.
there's 20 years worth of them or something.
Yeah, I know. Who is that? Oh, I'm a big fan of Nicholas Freeling. I don't know if anybody knows who he is. He was an English writer who lived in France for many years, and he wrote the Inspector van der Valk series, who was a Dutch policeman in Amsterdam, which I love that series. I see he's got another fan here. Yeah, they really are. And I remember the first Nicholas Freeling book I picked up, I was at a bus stop in San Francisco and it was raining and I wanted a good mystery book, and I ran into an actual bookstore that existed then, and I picked up Au Près de ma Blonde, started to read it, and he killed off his detective. So I was reading the last Inspector van der Valk book, and I thought, oh my God, how could he kill off his detective in the 3rd chapter? How could this be? And then his wife goes on to
Spoiler.
yeah. His wife, they were published in the 60s, you know, but his wife goes on to solve the murder. But then I had to go back and read all the earlier ones, you know. So I guess Nicholas Freeling just had enough of his inspector, and Mankell had enough of Wallander and killed him too.
Well, I don't have enough of Crispin. It's just that I always planned on ending the series. I just don't think that series should go on and on forever, because sometimes it really does look like the author is tired, and that they start to repeat themselves. And, you know, I just didn't want it to get stale. So
Yeah,
I had a definite endpoint.
Yeah, our Skylar Drake mystery, we originally wrote 4 in our series, but we got comments from many of our readers that were saying, but you never gave him a love interest. You can't just leave him hanging there. Well, we had killed off a lot of the characters along the way, so we had to introduce a whole lot of new characters and write that 5th book so that people would be happy. So there ended up being 5 in the series.
I personally don't like to read romance, you know, even the bodice-ripping historical stuff. And everybody says, well, when is she going to have a love interest? And I don't want her to have, I don't want Julia, my astrologer, to have a love interest, because I want her to be a lone wolf who can really take chances. And when you bring in that element, but I keep, you know, getting questions from people like, why doesn't she have a love interest?
Well, one of my books, the character has this very sweet romance with this wonderful man, but it turns out that he's overly protective and doesn't want her to go off and do these cases if there's any element of danger. So, of course, she has to break off with him. You know, that's,
Yeah.
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 So
You can have
you.
her lone wolf.
We have another
Yeah.
question over here.
Yeah. My question is, you have these series, and some of you have an end to these series. So my question is, Jeri, do you think of your sidekicks or some of the more close characters to your main character of having a spin-off? Like in television, you have spin-offs.
Yeah.
The books have spin-offs for their characters.
Not the Crispin books. I will be done. Actually, all the new series I write now are going to be trilogies. And that was some of the advice from my agent, because then it's quicker that way. Move on to the next series. And that way you can have a sort of a very long book, because each book is its own thing, but it also sort of stretches. There's a back story going on that can stretch with 3 books. And in the case of my urban fantasy, The Book of the Hidden, that was 4 books. I meant to do 6. He was trying to convince me to do 3, and I said, no, it's got a long story, I need at least 4. That has a spin-off. So there's a character that's a werewolf that becomes a werewolf. That's the werewolf mysteries. And he lives in Huntington Beach, and he's a surfer. So that's kind of a lot of comedy in that book.
Yeah, Jen and I were talking about that just last night. We were saying about how you have to be careful that sometimes these odd characters don't hijack the story.
Yeah.
And then they're going to demand their own book.
Yeah, well, he got one. So.
Are there any more questions, comments, criticisms? Well, we're
Hopes,
going.
fears.
I have a question.
Sure.
How long does it take to write a book? And what's the average time?
I don't think there is
I
one.
don't think there is an average time, but in genre, because I know an awful lot of historical novelists who take 3 or 4 years to write a novel, which I can't do in genre because your publisher expects a book every year.
Yeah.
So for
Yeah,
the
they
Crispin
want
books,
they
it's
want a
about
book a
9
year.
months for me. And some of the paranormal ones are about 6 months.
I was under, go ahead, I'm
Do
sorry.
you use an outline? I mean, it's your whole story and then you go back
I
to
used to
it?
outline a lot, and particularly because of that I was doing other series, I wanted to know what I was going to do today and tomorrow. And that was fine for many years, until a couple of years ago, and I could not outline to save my life. So I started again writing by the seat of my pants, and I'm enjoying that too. But yeah, so it changed. There's no one way. I mean, I'm sure we all have 3-5 different ways to do it here, but
My first book took 2 years to write, but I had no clue what I was doing. I didn't have a publisher, so I kept rewriting and rewriting. I must have had about 100 drafts by the time I was done. And then when I sent it out, I got a publisher pretty quickly. But then when you have a publishing deal, Connie and I were talking about that, they want it. You have deadlines you have to meet, so you don't have that choice. You have to have it in by a certain time.
Yeah. Yeah, when I was the first published series I had was Soup Lovers, and they wanted to give me 6 months for each manuscript. And my agent said, I need to get you more time because most people need about a book a year. And I said, I didn't want to chase them away, so I said, no, if you can get 9 months, that would be great. I can do it. She came back and she said, well, they're going to give you 8 months. Which I said, well, thank you. But what I realized that I had to do was I had to finish the book in 6 months, no matter what it took, and to give myself those last 2 months to give it to people to read, to revise, to change things that I didn't like. So really 6 months for a pretty decent draft. I didn't have to change a lot, but I did have to hear criticism and expose it to the world. But that was tough to do.
Nancy, how long do you take, Nancy?
Oh, well, it depends on the book. I mean, the first book took about 3-4 years, but I was working full-time then. And the second book took about 5 months because I was so thrilled to be writing a second mystery and have someone actually want it. And the one I'm working on now, I've just finished the first draft. I got a very late start, May. I started it in May, and it's due February 1st. So this gives me 3 months to rewrite it and show it to people, which is good. But the first draft, getting it out that fast was really tough.
Well, this being
including research, because
Yeah.
medieval mysteries, I have to research the real people, what's going on. And even the Victorian one, even though it's fantasy, I still want the history, that foundation to be there, correct. and then I can mess with it, but it's got to be right. The slang, the food, the clothing, and everything else. The train timetables, that's been lots of fun. So, yeah.
And I don't write historical, but I write contemporary, but we still have to do a lot of
Oh, yeah.
research as well, because blood splatter, I mean, there is some, I need to know what it looks like, what color it is. In my second book, I think it was, I forget now, but I had a pig as a murder suspect because I read about hogs in Italy that the mafia used. So I had to read about that and figure out how I could make that realistic enough so that they would believe that the hog could have devoured the body. So there's all sorts of research that we do, even in contemporary
Even as
novels.
simple as the
Yeah.
uniforms of the cops in that
That's
particular
right.
city.
Yeah.
Well, this being November, National Write a Book in a Month.
Oh, yeah.
NaNoWriMo. My first novel was a result of that, but all you can get done in that month is maybe a rough first draft, and that's just the bones, basically. And then comes the fun part, the real rewriting and editing and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting till you get it.
When I was young, it was the creation. That was the thing, I'm a writer. The creation, but now it's the rewriting. I just get it down on paper. Just get it down and then fix it later.
There's that saying that says you can't fix a blank page.
Yeah.
Ann Tyler, does anyone know Ann Tyler, her books? She's a wonderful writer. She said that for the first 63 drafts, she pretends no one is ever going to see it but herself. I love that.
That's good.
Isn't that good?
I like that.
Yeah.
Well, I think what we're going to do is we're going to try and get a picture of all of us together, and then we're going to let the authors all get set up so you can talk to them a little more personally and maybe look at their books and buy some. Over here, and they'll sign them for you over on the tables over here.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.